actions in the same level because they don't interact at all. They're all independent subproblems. So you do 15 actions all in the first level and you're done. Okay, then really you have a one length encoding. But this guy won't find it because this guy would say only one action can occur per level, and so this guy will require a 15 length encoding, which is unnecessarily more variables and more constraints. So it would not be very efficient. It will solve the problem, but it won't be very efficient. So this one, on the other hand, says, let's think in the backward direction. Basically, here I said a proposition P at J remains true if no action occurring at J plus 1 deletes P. So you reasoned in the forward direction. Here I reasoned in the backward direction. A proposition P changes values between J and J plus 1 only if an action occurs that makes it so. Okay, so all I'm saying is, if in fact Pi is not true in the jth level, and it became true at the j plus 1th level, it better be the case that a subset of actions which have Pi as one of their effects, one of them has actually occurred in the middle. You see what I'm saying? Instead of being action-centric and pushing propositions over actions, you have become proposition-centric, and you're saying and one of those actions must have occurred. You know, the reason P went from false to true is because some action which has P as an effect occurred. This looks like a really small change. It almost, you won't think about this. This is the problem with thinking of problems at the compilation level versus at the conceptual level. Okay? From a conceptual level, these almost look like I'm saying the same thing. But at the compilation level, what this allows you to say is, now I don't care which action occurred at this level. You know, as long as the action that occurred is ensuring that this transition does occur. Okay, now the only question I need to make sure is, so this actually allows me to, this disjunction can be satisfied even if more than one action occurs. One saying, you know, P, so in the same level, 5 actions occurred, one gives P, and the others don't have any effect on P. And I would still be happy because P, that accounts for why P changed its state. The only thing I don't want is, of those 5 actions, there are 2 actions, one says P, another says not P. Then I would say they're interacting. Or one says P, and the other says I require not P. Then in what way can you do these actions in parallel? So if I have an action A1, which gives me P, another action A2, that requires not P, or vice versa. So or alternately, an action A1 which deletes P, and an action A2 which requires P. In that case, it doesn't make sense to do them in parallel. The assumption of parallel actions basically means any serialization would be equivalent. This is like your database transaction serializability. Okay, you can do actions in parallel if in fact every serialization will wind up having the same exact effect. And that won't happen if the actions are interacting. So I just say no pair of interacting actions can occur together. Now how do I know whether a pair of actions are interacting or not? I just told you. A pair of actions are interacting if there is an intersection between their effects list and their preconditions list. Okay? So if one A is giving P, the B is giving not P, then they're interacting. If A is giving P, B requires P, then they're interacting. If A giving P and B requires not P, they're interacting. You say, well, this seems like more times they're interacting, but there are also many, many more times when they don't interact because actions just change a few state variables. So most of the time they are kind of independent. They're changing independently in different sets of state variables, so they're not interacting at all. So for every pair of actions that are actually interacting, I will write this mutex constraint. Here I wrote it for every pair of actions, period. Here I only wrote it for the interacting actions. First of all, of course, there are fewer constraints here than this. But much bigger deal is for that 15 actions in one level solving the problem. This guy would have been able to solve it with k equal to 1 encoding. This guy would have required k equal to 15 encoding. Now again, normally the idea is the way you convert, if I give you a bounded length planner and you need to solve the problem, right? How do you do? Basically, you have to schedule this. So one dumb idea is see if there is a k equal to 1 size. Okay, so give it k equal to 1, they'll set up an encoding, give it to the SAT solver says no solution, you come back and say k equal to 2, you make a compilation for k equal to 2 and give it to the SAT solver, and it says no, you come back and give it k equal to 3, etc. That's one way. But that's like you basically put this in a loop where k keeps increasing until you find a solution. Now of course, if I gave you a planning problem which has no solution, all bets are off, because you just keep going. But even if there is a solution, you obviously know, being from computer science, that going 1, 2, 3 is a dumb idea. Okay, what would actually make sense is if you have some intuition that this problem looks like it should have a solution at about 55 steps or smaller. Suppose you have an upper bound on the length of the solution. Then I start at 55. Now, in fact, what is interesting is you might say, well, if 55 is, if in fact the minimal size solution it has is only 42, then I solved a 55 encoding. In some sense, I'm solving a larger encoding. It turns out there's an interesting second order effect there, that it's not always just the size of the encoding that matters. It also matters as to how critically constrained the encoding is. We have done work which basically shows that, you know, if in fact the solution first occurs at the 42nd level, if you set up the encoding to 50 levels, solving that is cheaper than solving the 42 level encoding, oftentimes. Because there are many more solution paths, and so your solver, a systematic solver, is less likely to have to backtrack. Whereas the other guy will have many fewer choices and it's critically constrained. You see what I'm saying? But anyway, in fact, another guy in planning who actually got a best dissertation award by solving this single problem, which is if I were to give you a bounded length planner, like based on SAT or something, what would be the optimal schedule to call it in? Suppose you want to, because you're not just interested in finding a plan, but you're interested in finding the optimal plan. If I'm finding just a plan, then I call it 55, and if it gives me a solution, I'm happy. If I'm looking for the optimal solution, after 55, I have a solution at 55, let's say. But then what is the smallest solution? Shall I try 54? Of course not. You can do binary search, but he actually goes beyond that. To get a best dissertation award, you need a little bit more than that. Okay, but that's an interesting technical problem. How do you schedule? This is the scheduling of computation. Okay, but anyway, I hope you understood at this point that there are two different ways of setting up the encoding. All they differ in is the frame axiom, which would look like a small difference for most people at the planning level, but becomes a huge difference at the compilation level. And so in fact, this is a way better idea than this. You would only use this if you didn't think about this. And in fact, 95, they didn't think about this, so they used this. And then right at that time, it turns out that, right at that time, I don't have it here. Planning graph plan was being developed parallelly. 95 is also the graph plan year. And it turns out, graph plan, when it sets up the planning graph, and when you're searching for solution in the backward direction, in essence, it is solving this encoding. In essence, it's solving that encoding, at least the backward search of the planning graph. And when people realized that, then they reinvented that in terms of the backward search, but I reinvented it again for you as just a different proof. It's a regression-based proof of the plan. This is a progression-based proof of the plan. This one is going forward, this one is going backward. Okay, so there are two encodings. The thing that I leave you with today, before you go off to trick or treat, is there is a different way of proving the correctness of a plan, which is neither forward nor backward. All that matters for a plan to be correct is the goals are supported. That means there is somebody in the plan, this is the plan, and this is supposed to be satisfying these goals. So there better be somebody who gives this condition, such that after they give this condition, nobody comes and deletes this condition. That's a good support. So for every goal, make sure that this condition is satisfied. That means there is a supporter, and after the supporter, there is no deleter. You do this for all the conditions. So there's a set of constraints, one for each of the conditions. It's a different kind of proof. It can be much smaller, right? Because you're only proving each condition separately. Except, however, when I start that, okay, in A is being supported by load A, that's fine, but then load A has its own preconditions. Load A is going to give me in A if in fact load A actually takes place. For it to take place, somebody must give its preconditions. So I need to do whatever reasoning I did here to here also. That means for each of these conditions, there should be somebody before them who gives it, such that nobody that comes after the contributor and before the consumer deletes it. Now it doesn't look as interesting, because now you have a whole bunch of preconditions. The top level goals are just preconditions of a dummy goal action. And every action's preconditions must be satisfied, must be established by somebody, with nobody coming after them deleting. If I can show that contributor structure, then I have proved that the plan is correct. And if you look at the 96 paper, there is a plan space encoding, which I won't talk about today, but if there is interest, we can talk about next time. It turns out you can set up causal proof encodings too, which are essentially a different kind of a third type of encoding. For every type of proof, there is a type of encoding. Okay, and we'll start with